great new health care plan. Well, this is raising new questions for many of voters who put Trump in office as president. A new AP analysis shows that more than 7 million of the nearly 9 million people who signed up for Obamacare coverage next year live in states where Trump won. On the Democrat side, there are signs that they'll try and negotiate with Republicans in 2018. But when it comes to President Trump, there aren't many indicators that Democrats are turning over a new leaf in the new year. Watch.
I don't think that we've ever seen a president who has so damaged the foundations of democracy as this president has done. And, you know, it happens on a daily basis. And the risk in not speaking out and speaking out in the harshest terms is that we normalize his behavior. And I don't think many Democrats are willing to do that.
Well, let's see. Is it normalizing behavior, or is it an entire party crying wolf, David Webb?
It's an entire party crying wolf. Hang on, let me get this. The president, the executive branch, decided to say to the Congress, the legislative branch, the Constitution says you need to take action on that. Oh, my God, it's the end of the republic. Look, here's the reality. And you look at the CMS numbers. Of the enrollees, over 8 million right now, the Democrats are touting. Only 2.3 million cumulative as of this Thursday's report, according to CMS, are new enrollees. These are re-enrollees in those states. Therefore, those voters are baked in.
Yeah, and sometimes they're also looky-loos, and it's hard to get the actual numbers because there are people who sign up, but they don't actually pay for the coverage and end up not getting it through the exchanges. But
right, they have to complete the process, even if CMS gets the number. But again, 2.3 million out of it.
Some of these are real voters, are real people for whom repealing the individual mandate without dealing overall with Obamacare, like Republicans have tried to do, doing it haphazardly can have some unintended consequences for people. And a lot of these folks who are left on the exchanges, who are left on Obamacare, will actually rely more on the government, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's subsidy.
Or is it just self-preservation, because these people don't know where to go, and they're looking for an alternative, and a lot of it might be, Lisa Booth, panic buying.
Well, but it's also they don't have options. I mean, if you look at a lot of these Midwestern and Southern states that we're talking about in places that President Trump won, it's a lack of options. They have one insurer maybe to choose from in 2018, if that. So a lot of it, they don't have any other choice besides going on these exchanges. So that's the flaw with Obamacare. It's left a lot of people without options in this country. But in terms of some sort of bipartisan thing on Obamacare, I think that's going to be tough. I mean, clearly we've already had an agreement regarding the subsidies aspect of Obamacare with Alexander Murray.
Do you think there's an actual agreement? Do you think that Republicans will actually pass that in the new year?
Well, I think Susan Collins was promised that.
She thinks there was.
Well, allegedly, she said she was promised it for her vote on the tax reform law. So, I mean, I don't think that they would make that promise to her unless they intended on bringing that up for a vote and unless there was some strong support.
Okay, but you bring up something really important, and I want to bring Katie into this because I think that's critical. People want more choices.
Right.
And Republicans have already failed on health care. Is there any way that they get together with Democrats and stabilize the markets and give people the proliferation of choices they deserve?
Based on what Mitch McConnell is saying about the new agenda starting in 2018, he doesn't really have an interest of making this a priority. He wants to move on to other things like Dodd-Frank reform. He has said that on the record. So I'm not so confident they're going to bring this up. However, I think it's important to address the issue of Democrats touting these enrollment numbers. When the government forces you to buy something or be fined, of course more people are going to sign up for something because they are required by law to do so, or they are punished by the IRS. When it comes to options, rural areas have been completely decimated by Obamacare. Rural hospitals have closed. 7 out of 10 doctors have retired early, and so the only option now is for the free market to come back in with the taking away of the individual mandate, not forcing people to buy something they couldn't afford in the first place, didn't want, and something that isn't actually health care. It's simply expensive health insurance.
Hold on, that's a really good point, because in a lot of these areas there's been forced consolidation, and that's what happens when you have a government monopoly and you don't have a lot of choices in these rural areas, and there's no upside for these doctors, you know, who had community centers.
The majority leader, Mitch McConnell, said that he didn't want to readdress and go back to repeal in 2018. That wasn't necessarily a reflection of the subsidies aspect of this. with morality.
He said he didn't want to bring it up as a topic.
He said he didn't want to look at repeal in 2018.
He said he didn't want to bring it up as a priority in terms of what's on the table for the agenda because he feels like it's a distraction moving forward with infrastructure, and Dodd-Frank and all the other things on the table.
Before you get to that part of it, let's look at the reality of what he would have to do. Work with Democrats. Democrats, it doesn't serve them to work with the Republicans on this. You would need 60 votes in some cases outside of reconciliation to do this. You can't get Democrats on tax reform, which is actually for the poor. You can't get them to be honest about Obamacare when over 80% of the people who pay the Obamacare penalty, the tax penalty, make under $50,000 a year. And they're not all in the wings of the country. They're in small towns. They're in areas where access to care, like 20 counties in Ohio, has been taken away from them.
Yeah, but that's absolutely right. And Marie, I think this is something that Democrats need to address. Yeah. And that's the more government involvement there is, the fewer choices there are. And as Katie pointed out, that hurts not only low-income people, but people in rural areas who geographically don't have access to care. What is so wrong with free market solutions providing more choices?
Well, as a concept, that's fine, but when we get down to brass tacks of what will happen in the Senate, I agree with Lisa. Mitch McConnell made a promise to Susan Collins. I do think you will, if they bring that forward, they keep the promise, I think you will see Democrats who will support that because they believe we cannot purposefully do things to tank Obamacare if you're not actually willing to repeal and replace it. That is one place I actually think Democrats, like people like Joe Manchin, Claire McCaskill, others may get on board with. And I hope he keeps his promise to Susan Collins because she took a chance voting for tax reform based on that promise. He said by the end of the year, that's not going to happen. Let's see how well this keeps the caucus together.
He said, let's move on. But as far as Susan Collins, she's not even a Republican. And I know you've said in the past,
they need her. But now with losing Alabama,
the party would gladly give her away if you played Red Rover.
It's a numbers game, Kennedy. It's a numbers game.
Joe Manchin is not in the leadership. He doesn't matter.
Chuck Schumer is the one running the show.
Guys, you've lost Alabama. Republicans need every vote. They need Susan Collins. They cannot lose her by breaking this promise.
She's so powerful now.
Poor Kennedy.
All right, the White House says it will have an outline for an infrastructure plan in just a few weeks. President Trump is going to focus on selling the proposal during his first State of the Union address. That's coming up January 30th. Now, unlike tax reform, an infrastructure bill will need at least some Democratic support for it to pass. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell says she's keeping an open mind.
I will work with Donald Trump on anything that helps the working men and women of my district. So yes, I'll work with him on infrastructure if he'll work with us. We've needed to do something about infrastructure for decades. We've got an aging infrastructure with potholes and highways that aren't working and bridges that are in trouble. We need to do something together to fix our infrastructure if we're going to stay competitive as a nation.
All right, so Lisa, it's obvious that Democrats aren't going to be as willing to compromise on health care. There's such a huge divide philosophically. Infrastructure is a different story, though. How do Democrats go about working together? I mean, is it like two vipers mating?
Exactly like that. No, I think there's interest for bipartisanship perhaps on infrastructure, but there's two key differences. Obviously, the funding aspect of this and how it is funded is going to be a divide between Republicans and Democrats, so I don't quite know how they get to an agreement on that aspect. And also the environmental and regulatory aspect of this as well, because clearly Republicans would like to get rid of some of those regulatory hurdles to move forward with some of these projects.
And make the permitting process easier.
Exactly. Whereas Democrats want those barriers up. They're more concerned about the environment. So I think those are going to be the two key differences that they're going to have to reach.
Well, I think here's
the real push for infrastructure. The people who have to do the work. Most of the contracts in states are already set in place. They're already there. The teams have been picked. The bidding is done. It's about a 2 to 5 year process. The unions are going to push for this, and they're the ones that are going to push Democrats to do something about it because they want the work. So, it's great to talk about the D.C. view of this, but in reality, those contracts are in place. Those bidders are done. The unions are going to say, we want the work for our different...
But there's no money for
IBEW.
it
No, well, this goes to the money part of it.
Why the D.C. part matters.
Well, the D.C. part of this is tax revenues have increased to the government this past year. Discretionary spending exists. Well, but here's where they can use it. The federal government can use that to spur the infrastructure. The continued growth offsets.
Yeah, okay, but we have to take a step back here because, as you know, for 7 years, conservative Tea Party Republicans at that time were very concerned about overspending. The Obama administration was heavily criticized for spending $1 trillion on a stimulus package that was supposed to be $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, admitted that shovel-ready jobs weren't shovel-ready. However,
concrete toilets.
This White House has already paved the way through the permitting process and taking away the regulatory burden on the economy and on new projects so they can get ready for this come springtime. And that doesn't mean that Republicans are against the environment. You can build big projects, you can have infrastructure reform, and you can do it while you are making sure the environment is preserved. However, there is going to be a fight not just between Republicans and Democrats on this, but between Republicans and Republicans when it comes to how to pay for this, especially when we haven't even addressed spending cuts at all.
We haven't talked about it. Entitlement reform, you're absolutely right, Katie. And, you know, again, I turn to the lonely Democrat on the couch.
The outnumbered Democrat.
There's a lonely libertarian.
Okay, that's always lonely. That's
I'm the lonely guy. Okay?
There's a lot of lonely people on this couch.
And it's the holiday
Katie and I are maybe not as
why alcohol consumption is up. But I want to ask you, what's wrong with privatization? What's wrong with bidding this out and allowing private contractors to come in instead of just expecting that government is going to do the most bang-up job building our bridges and roads?
I think the Democrats, some of them, would get behind a public-private partnership bill, infrastructure bill, that does a little of each, that puts government funding behind some of it, that puts private funding behind some of it. Lisa hit the nail on the head on regulations, on spending. And so if the White House indicates that it's willing to do some compromising here, because they will need to get Democrats, I think there are some Democrats who would also do some compromising. A lot of people think the Trump administration should have started with infrastructure to begin with.
The president said it was just too easy, though. It was too easy.
Let's see how easy it is in an election year.
I think of all the things that there could be compromise on, there's a much greater likelihood of Democrats working with the Republicans on infrastructure than taxes or health care or any other bipartisan failures.
Well, it's harder now in an election year, but we'll see.
I think we should all start using that moving forward. Why didn't you do that? It was too easy.
It's too easy.
Too easy for me.
It would have been too easy.
I didn't want to get a job after college. It's too easy. Democrats eyeing a potential House majority ahead of the 2018 midterms. New reports say they believe this might be their best shot in years to make that happen. Whether they should be optimistic or be careful of getting too complacent. Plus, a GOP congressman says it's time to purge FBI and DOJ officials with a liberal bias. At the top of his list, the FBI agent removed from the special counsel's Russia investigation after sending anti-Trump texts to his colleague in Paramore. Does this congressman have a point, or is he overreacting?
I'm very concerned that the DOJ and the FBI, whether you want to call it deep state or what, are kind of off the rails.
Welcome back. New reaction to calls from a freshman Republican congressman for a, quote, purge of allegedly biased anti-Trump agents and officials in the FBI and the DOJ. Here's Florida Congressman Francis Rooney.
I'm very concerned that the DOJ and the FBI, whether you want to call it deep state or what, are kind of off the rails. I would like to see the directors of those agencies purge it and say, look, we've got a lot of great agents, a lot of great lawyers here. Those are the people that I want the American people to see and know the good work's being done, not these people who are kind of the deep state.
Congressman Rooney going after FBI officials Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. Strzok was removed from the special counsel's Russia investigation after it was revealed that he sent anti-Trump text messages to Page. Republican Congressman Ron DeSantis echoing those calls earlier today.
I think there has been problems with the leadership. Obviously, Comey, I think the president was right to fire Comey. And then you look at a guy like Peter Strzok. If he's going to say that it's his job as an FBI agent to prevent a certain candidate from getting elected and creating an insurance policy, that is somebody that you do not want to have power. And so anybody who turns up in that situation, you know, I think that they should get another line of work.
Many Democrats see growing pressure on the Justice Department as an attempt to derail the Russia investigation. Some believe the president is behind it.
I'm worried about, you know, anyone in the position that the president's in trying to take down the very institutions that we hold dear and that are precisely what keeps us from, you know, falling like many other countries do to dictatorships.
David, is it time for the FBI to clean house?
Yes, it is. I know a lot of these agents, unlike a lot of people who claim to. I've known a lot of agents, senior agents. I have family in law enforcement. The one thing they hate is to see this happen. Over the years and in the Obama years, they added a number of deputy directors at the FBI that have simple responsibilities like overseeing a congressional committee. The problem is they've politicized part of it, which affects ongoing investigations and the culture within the FBI. And the agents who you talk to are really doing the job. They're sick of this. Whether they're Republicans or Democrats, they made a commitment to law enforcement. And the president's not, Jackie Spear, I don't know where she gets this ridiculous talking point from. You can't take down the FBI as a president. It's not a path to dictatorship. But you do need to clean out, and if you look at the code of ethics and what you would do to go in front of a judge or a court, when you've got someone who is sending those kind of text messages, that would not pass a basic voir dire to get into a grand jury. So let's deal with this realistically for what it is.
Actually, Marie, do you think Americans deserve to know what the insurance policy was that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page talked about?
I think all those questions deserve to be answered. These are important. But I also think, first of all, Peter Strzok was removed from the investigation, and there cannot be
He's still at the FBI,
there
though.
cannot, but FBI officers are allowed to have personal political opinions, and if we get in the business,
it's irrelevant.
If we get in the business,
but he's also was a lead. He was a lead part of this investigation.
And he was taken off of it, and until we have hard evidence that people's personal political views impacted the outcome of investigations, I think we owe it to the men and women of the FBI.
This isn't the men and women of the FBI.
Please let me finish what I'm saying. There are dozens and dozens of people who work on these investigations. Letting one bad apple who was removed from it taint the whole investigation, I think, is problematic and is not fair.
Katie, is it just one bad apple, or what do you make of that?
Well, there is a suits versus boots problem at all of the federal law enforcement agencies. I've been saying this for years, whether it's ATF or the FBI. The brass at the top typically has political problems. They go after certain investigations and expect certain outcomes based on their own political leanings. So yes.
On both sides of the aisle, would you say?
I am actually not talking about both sides of the aisle because Washington, D.C. is a creature of liberal federal government, and the people at the top brass usually tend to lean left. But the broader point of this is it's not about FBI agents holding personal political points of view. It's about the fact that these text messages show that they were using an official office to have a meeting inside of Andrew McCabe's office to discuss an insurance policy. They weren't at coffee. They weren't out at dinner having a conversation with friends. They were inside an official government office having this conversation. And in terms of what Jackie Spear is saying, the President of the United States is in charge of the executive branch, which is the FBI is under the jurisdiction of that in the Department of Justice. He has every authority and right to say, we need to clean house. Christopher Wray is already doing that. And we're going to see the results of that, hopefully, because it's not just about Republicans. It's about Democrats being targeted as well. Because if you target one party, you can target the other.
Well, and Kenny, I want to get you in here. And there's been a lot of downplaying of this and quite frankly, a lack of coverage about the insurance policy. Some of these text messages that we've seen, Democrats in the media are saying that any criticism or any concern over that anti-Trump bias, that you're impeding the investigation. But what kind of coverage would we see if the insurance policy was about Hillary Clinton as opposed to President Trump? August 2016, months before the November election, what would we be seeing and watching?
There certainly is a disparity in coverage. There's no doubt about that. And I think, there are plenty of people in the media who would be having kittens. There would be feral cats running around the halls of media institutions. But as Jackie Spear is saying that the president is trying to take down one of our institutions, and that leads us on a road to a dictatorship, there are people who worry that there are senior members of the FBI who are compromised, and they're trying to take down the institution of the presidency. That's why we always need government oversight. It doesn't matter what the party is. It doesn't matter what the branch is. And the one thing I will say is be careful when you use words like purge, because then, when the opposition is in power, what are they going to do to purge people that they are not ideologically aligned with? I think that is always incredibly dangerous. You have to be careful about that, but you always have to be mindful and watchful of government.
That's a good point. And we also have the Inspector General probe as well, so we'll be looking to see what happens with that. Well, also looking ahead to 2018, Democrats confident they can retake the House. So what's their message to win over the voters that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016? Plus impeachment fever. Why some Democrat Party leaders are putting the brakes on such talks. But will their voters accept it? We're going to debate. You're going to want to stay tuned.
Well, Democrats are bullish on their chances in 2018, and according to The Hill, they're banking on the president's low approval numbers, the fact that the party of the president historically loses seats in the midterms, and what they see as the GOP's thin legislative record. Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi says Republicans know they're going to lose, and their push to pass tax reform before the end of the year showed that they're getting desperate.
They're acting like people who know that their power is short-lived. This is really a big opening. The door is open. The president's numbers are in the 30s. I think probably his numbers and the support for the tax bill are probably similar.
But RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel says it's the Republicans and not the Democrats who have a record to run on.
Let's look at the record of Republicans and this president this first year. Unemployment at a 17-year low. Consumer confidence at a record high. You look at the Dow. You look at these tax cuts. So what it's going to mean for the middle class to get more money in their paychecks. We are delivering on promises that we made. We have an accomplishment column that is very large. And the Democrats have nothing to run on. They've done nothing this year. And I just don't think that's going to resonate in 2018.
Marie, are Democrats really going to argue that Republicans pushed through tax reform for 81% of the, to 83% of the middle class because they were worried about losing elections? Is that going to be their argument?
I don't think that'll be an argument in this election. I do think most people agree that they needed to get this done because they couldn't finish the year out with having nothing done. You mentioned the historically low approval rating for President Trump. In midterm elections, the party in power usually loses seats. And a generic ballot right now across the polls, a generic Democrat is beating a generic Republican by over 10 points. So I think that Republicans would be wrong to be overconfident going into the midterms. We were. Democrats were overconfident. Democrats were overconfident in 2010, and we lost because of it.
And 2016 too. But Lisa,
and we lost because of it.
Right, Lisa, I want to go to you because you've run a few campaigns or have been on campaign staff.
Yeah.
What is the Republican strategy here? Because as we're going to talk about in a little while, Democrats have it out for the president. They've resisted his agenda all year. There are questions about whether they're going to do that going into 2018. They don't have a lot of things to run on. How can Republicans capitalize on some of their successes this year?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the candidate. It depends on the congressional district, particularly looking at the House. I mean, we are simply going to see some Republicans that are distancing themselves from President Trump. We've seen it with every president. Democrats did that with President Obama as well, particularly in those congressional districts, I think 24 that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So we are going to see that. But to your point about tax reform, Republicans have been talking about this for 30 years, like decades now.
Yeah,
so that's why they got this down. But that's why they got it done. It wasn't about the elections. This was simply about fulfilling a promise.
David, to address Nancy Pelosi's point.
Real quick, on just one last point on that. In the House, I think things are going to be much tougher for Republicans. In the Senate, there's only one state that a Republican incumbent is running in that Hillary Clinton won. That's the state of Nevada. 10 states Democrats are running in that President Trump won. 5 he won by double digits.
Yeah, to address Nancy Pelosi's point of rushing this through because Republicans feel like they're going to lose power and they're holding on to the last grips of it. Wasn't it the president who set a Christmas deadline, not Republicans?
And by the way, the fact is it was there, it was signed, it went through, they passed it, he kept his promise. Nancy Pelosi talking about rushing, everyone should just laugh and walk away. Here's some of the realities in the voting and the changes in the last several years between 2010, 12, and now, is the change in electorate, and this is what matters. We've seen the change in state legislatures. We've seen the change in congressional districts. We do have to be concerned about the gerrymandering and rigging that both sides, conduct when it comes to redistricting. However, Republicans are not in any danger in the House for a simple reason. They have success coming, and the lagging indicator of this will come in the summer if the economy continues to go. And on the other side, you've got a DNC that in 10 years has had their lowest fundraising quarter and decline in numbers. The money's not there to run.
Kennedy, we hear a lot about the president's base and how it's still very solid. We don't hear a whole lot about how independents are feeling. Typically, they tend to vote less in midterm elections. But what do you think that they're looking at in this coming year? I mean, do you think that they'll turn out to vote?
That's great news for the president. And, Democrats have to be very careful to only rely on the president's low approval numbers. That's not enough, and that doesn't dictate about how people feel about their local politicians, even though these are U.S. congressmen and women, these are still often races run on local issues. And David's right. If the economy continues to do well and you see other indicators, whether it's housing or the job market, consumer confidence,
regulatory
GDP,
reform.
If those numbers continue to improve, then you're not going to see this agitated passion to switch parties and people in positions of power. But on the other hand, Republicans shouldn't be too confident, because the only thing Republicans have done right this year is tax reform. Everything else they have essentially failed on. Regulatory issues have mostly to do with,
and historically,
all of
not
this
necessarily
pushes
with Congress. There's a perception of congressional failure.
Yeah, but if historicals were true and Poland was true, Trump wouldn't be president.
We're moving on. And as they attempt to take back the House next year, Democrats are reportedly split over whether to push for President Trump's impeachment. Back in November, nearly a third of the House Democratic caucus voted to begin debate on impeachment.
Those who will look back through the vista of time at this time will conclude that there were some people who refused to allow a president to continue to bring shame, to continue to dishonor the office.
It's important that we not let the failure of the Republicans